Hello, this is Joshua Mack from Cornerstone Bible Church, and we're talking marriage and family. I'm probably going to ramble a little today. It's a Friday, but I hope you'll be patient with me. I thought I could begin by just telling you a story. It's a story about me, actually, me and laundry. So Marta and I have been married, I guess, 26 years now. And I'm so thankful for the way that she served me all these years. And one of the ways she serves our family so well is by doing the laundry. And yet, one of the things I used to wonder about the laundry, can you believe it? She does the laundry, and I sometimes would wonder about the way in which she did the laundry. And this was earlier on in our marriage, but it's something kind of simple and silly, but I would often find the socks in my sock drawer inside out. And when I found the socks in my sock drawer inside out, I would sometimes think, I wonder why she doesn't turn them the right way out. Now, eventually, after years and years, I guess somehow that came up in a conversation, that question, and it's been 5 or 6 years now, I would think, maybe more, that Marta's always turned the socks the right way out for me when she does the laundry. And again, I'm obviously so grateful for such a kind wife. But the other day, something hit me, and I can't believe that I never thought about it before, and that's kind of the point. I, for many years, had wondered, why doesn't Marta turn the socks the right way when she does the laundry? And yet never once, I'm telling you, never once did I ask, why don't I turn the socks the right way when I put them in the laundry? It was like, honestly, a little bit of an epiphany. I had never stopped and looked at the world that way. Kind of shocking, right? And yet, that's sometimes the way we live life. Like, there are answers to our problems that are so obvious, and yet it's almost impossible for us to see them because we are so locked in on a certain way of looking at the world that it's hard for us to think, to even conceive there might possibly be another way. One of the reasons why this is difficult, and I guess something that makes it even more difficult for us to see things differently, is because we grow up in a certain culture. And our culture has discipled us, catechized us, trained us in a certain way of looking at the world and a certain way of thinking about how life is supposed to work. And often our culture does such a good job in teaching us how to think that way of thinking becomes almost so absolute in our minds. It's like you might say, a non-negotiable. Maybe you can see this a little easier if you think about another culture. When we were living in Africa, there were couples that we knew that were having a difficult time getting married. So they were dating, or whatever you want to call it, and yet they weren't getting married. And we would ask them, why are you not getting married? And the reason it was difficult for them to get married was because they had to pay something called lobola. And lobola is a price the man has to pay to the wife's family in order to marry their daughter. And yet, of course, that's not like in the rules of the government or anything. That's just a tradition, a cultural way of thinking and acting. And Sometimes the wife's family would set the lobola so high that it was impossible for the person, the man, to be able to come up with that kind of money. And of course, coming from outside of that culture, I would ask, why don't you just get married without paying the lobola? And when I would ask a question like that, it was almost like I was speaking a different language. Like, seriously, that was pretty much an impossible solution for them to even imagine. Paying the lobola was a non-negotiable, and actually paying the lobola was such a non-negotiable that they were willing to suffer and not get married if they weren't able to pay the lobola. The problem, of course, and maybe you can see it, the problem, of course, is when our culture gives us the wrong non-negotiables. And I guess that's kind of the point. Our culture trains us in a certain way of thinking. It tells us this is how life works and this is what's important. And sometimes it teaches us that certain things are non-negotiables. And those things become so important in our minds that we can't possibly look at doing life any other way. I guess an example for us, there are probably many examples, but an example for us maybe would be saving for retirement. Saving for retirement is almost a non-negotiable in our culture, and yet sometimes saving for events 40 years from now that's such a non-negotiable in our minds that we don't do things that we know actually are even more important biblically, like give or sacrifice for others. The two non-negotiables, though, that I'm really probably most concerned about as I've been thinking about life here in the United States and our approach. I think two non-negotiables in people's minds, two things that most people are so committed to that they don't even question, are their own comfort and their own pleasure. We live in a culture where, and really in a time period where it's possible to be comfortable, like it's possible almost always to be comfortable, and we can almost always make a choice to be comfortable, and if we don't like something, we just obviously we don't do it. It's not even like it's a question. I'm reading a book about remembering death, actually, and they were saying 100, 200 years ago, death was everywhere. You always saw death. Like, people died in their own homes. They're talking about Cotton Mather. I think he was a pastor in the 1700s or something. He had 14 children. 13 of them died before he did. Only one lived longer than Cotton Mather, and most of them, of course, died in the home. And so people saw death. It was everywhere. You couldn't get around it. And yet now, where is death? We're not used to it. And it's not just death. That's the thing. I was just thinking about suffering, and and being uncomfortable, we're able to fashion our lives so that we can almost always be comfortable. And as a result, we don't learn how to suffer for a while. We're not used to being uncomfortable. This was, I guess, one of the funny things I was reminded of on a trip to Malawi a number of years ago. I decided to take my girls on the bus to Malawi, and one of the reasons why I did it that way was because I wanted them to learn how to wait. And we didn't take a fancy bus or anything like that, just your everyday bus. And we got on this bus, and we were on the bus for maybe 36 hours, something that felt like forever. And when we got on the bus, they just give us this bag of chicken. It's like 8 a.m. and that's the meal you get for the rest of the trip. That was the big perk, I suppose. And they had a toilet in the bus, but the toilet didn't work, and it was uncomfortable. It was long. It actually, to me, it seemed kind of smelly. And yet, as we were traveling hour after hour, something that I noticed that I was pretty much the only person who was complaining. Like, I was the only one who was really thinking this was super difficult. And it struck me, I wasn't used to traveling that way, and I was used to traveling in comfort. And they were doing a better job than I was, and one of the reasons why they did a better job than I was doing was because they were used to being uncomfortable. And of course, I guess the point is that because we're used to being uncomfortable, because we're used to being comfortable, and because we can always make choices and we make so many choices on the basis of our own pleasure, that creates some problems for us. And it's a little tricky to talk about because obviously it's not wrong to be comfortable, and it's not wrong to choose to experience pleasure. But what happens, and this is issue, is when that becomes the non-negotiable. When that becomes the non-negotiable, like we can't even think about doing something else because our comfort and our pleasure is the non-negotiable. That does become a problem. And one reason it becomes a problem, especially when it comes to living out the Christian life and even being a good husband or a good wife, is because many relationships require being uncomfortable. Like long-term relationships, if you're going to have really God-honoring, life-changing, long-term relationships, you're going to have to be able to put up with a lot of things that aren't necessarily your idea of what is going to bring you the most pleasure at that particular point. And yet, often we short circuit those relationships. We don't even get close. I was listening to someone today who's just talking almost about the epidemic of loneliness in the United States. And you meet a lot of people who are growing older and they just don't have any really good friends. There's so many people who would say, I don't have anybody who knows me. It's almost like they're complaining about that, or just they recognize this is not the way it's supposed to be. And yet they're sort of in an impossible situation because you're never going to get those kinds of relationships if your comfort is a non-negotiable. Like, the only way to have those kinds of really transforming relationships is for something to be more important than your comfort and your pleasure. And yet, of course, I know there are so many outs, so many sort of excuses that we can give ourselves, and so many excuses other people will give us as well. And one of the reasons why those excuses are so attractive is because being uncomfortable, choosing something other than your own pleasure, requires you dying to yourself. It requires a death to self. I mean, think, for example, about Philippians chapter 2, because the Bible isn't sort of trying to hide this. Paul is pleading with Christians here, and it has to do with their relationships with one another. And he says, if there's any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Beautiful. But how? Do nothing from rivalry or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Which is shocking. Paul is saying, really, that following Jesus means picking up your cross and saying no to yourself in the nitty-gritty matters of life. Actually considering someone else more significant than yourself and putting their interests above your own. And I'll tell you one thing about putting someone else's interests above your own is that it's not comfortable. It's often not going to be something you do if it's your pleasure that matters most. And of course, it makes you ask why. The average unbeliever, I suppose, wouldn't really understand why we would ever die to self, and that's why they have all kinds of excuses they can give us as to why we shouldn't. But of course, we're not unbelievers. We've put our faith in Jesus Christ, and so we look to him. We look to him to save us, and we also look to him to learn how to live life. And he shows us how to live life. He holds out his hand to us, and he says, come, follow me. And what does following Jesus require? It requires picking up your cross and dying to yourself day after day. Now, why in the world would you ever do that? Why would you ever make anything more important than your comfort and your pleasure? It's because Jesus is good, and you are exercising your faith and trusting him. And you know that when he calls you to lose your life for his sake, he's calling you to do that because he loves you and he has something to offer you in its place. And you know, as Christians, we not only have just the fact that Jesus did this for us as a motivation to do this for others, we also we have the whole pattern. Like, we have proof that this way of living actually not only glorifies God, but in a sense you could say works, because Jesus, what happened to him? He humbled himself for our good. He did not consider his right, in a sense, as something to be grasped, but laid it aside and sought our interests, and didn't choose his comfort and didn't choose his pleasure and didn't act like that was the most important thing in the entire world, and died. And it was painful. You know, he was on the cross with nails to his wrist. Of course, that's painful. But what happened after that? He rose from the dead, and that is the pattern. That's the pattern for the Christian life, really. It's, I choose to trust Jesus and to die to myself, and to not make my pleasure and my comfort the non-negotiable, the most important thing, but to consider Jesus's interests, which I know are going to be your interests and your good. And so I seek your good and your interest. And that is painful, for sure. It's painful. Nobody's denying that. But I do that because I trust Jesus, and I can see what happened with Jesus. And I know that God's going to be faithful. And what's going to happen is, as I die to myself for the glory of God, after that, there's going to be a kind of a resurrection, in a sense. There's going to be joy and peace and eternal rewards, ultimately, that result. And so, I don't know. I told you, I warned you that I would do a little rambling. But we've been talking about marriage, and we've been talking about our relationship with our spouse, and I guess I'm just kind of burdened that if we don't learn a new way of looking at life, we're not really going to be able to have the kinds of relationships that do us good and that bring honor to God. And yet that new way of life is really hard for us to see, because we've been so trained by our culture to think of comfort and pleasure as absolute non-negotiables. And so I want to say, look to Jesus. And Jesus, of course, doesn't have a problem with comfort and pleasure. And so, yeah, be comfortable, experience pleasure to the glory of God. Great. But watch out. Don't make them non-negotiables. Don't make them non-negotiables. Because if your comfort and your pleasure comes first, if that's what's got to win in every situation, if that's really the primary thing that drives the decisions you make, then you're not going to be following Jesus. You might say you're a follower of Jesus, but you're going to be walking the opposite direction. And of course, if you're not following Jesus, you can't really expect to have a relationship with others, and certainly not one with your spouse, that brings him glory or that really is good for you. And so I just wanted to ask, will you trust Jesus enough to look again? To look again. Maybe you've been having problems, and you've always thought the solution was one thing, for, like me, for my spouse to fold the socks a different way. And you've never looked at life from another angle and realized, wait, there's actually another solution.